Hello, and a very warm welcome on behalf of the Museum of Art and Photography to our panel discussion, Ways of Remembering, Engaging with Studio Photography and the Archive. I'm Varun Nayar, a research editor at the museum and a co-curator of The Business of Dreams, our ongoing exhibition on the studio photographer Suresh Punjabi. Expanding on some of the ideas brought up in this exhibition, our discussion, as the title suggests, hopes to explore a number of ways in which we engage with photographic archives today, particularly those that originate in studios. Suresh's studio photographs from the 1970s and 80s, for instance, present us with a vivid picture of the industrial town of Nagda in Madhya Pradesh, where people's personal ideas of self-presentation sit atop a shifting terrain of social, cultural, and economic changes that happened after the Indian emergency. Looking at the thousands of faces that comprise this archive, we might ask ourselves a broader set of questions that move far beyond Nagda. Where does a photographic archive begin? How does our understanding of its materials change based on its presentation? Can archives make arguments? And what modes of remembering and reflecting can they encourage within us? To engage with some of these questions, I'm thrilled to be joined by three panelists who, through their respective works, can provide answers in some capacity to some of the themes that are brought up not only by the Suresh Punjabi exhibition, but also by some of these larger questions around archives. Each has also engaged with archival practices in South and Southeast Asia more broadly. I'm just going to quickly share my screen so that I can give you more of a visual representation of our three panelists. All right. So Shan Bhattacharya is a self-taught artist working with photographs and video based in Kolkata. In 2016, he received the inaugural Umrao Singh Sher-Gil Grant for photography for his text and image narrative work, Portal, The Curious Account of Achintya Bose, published by Tulika Books in 2020. He was also collaborated with the Kolkata-based. He has also collaborated with Kolkata-based independent musicians and bands to produce music videos and photographs as accompaniments to their music. Shan's approach to Portal, a work of fiction that emerges from a found archive, takes the form of a diary kept by the proprietor of Bose Color Studio in Kolkata during the 1990s. In quite literally constructing a history around this archive, Bhattacharya's arrangement of the book demonstrates a blurring of the narrative and the documentary quality of old photographs, and the possibility of the book format as a place for both the material of the past and technologies of today. Manit Sriwanchipoom is one of Thailand's leading photo artists and curators. His works have been exhibited internationally in India, Germany, France, Italy, the United States, and beyond. Over the past 10 years, Manit has been looking for unknown local heroes in photography in Thailand, a project that has turned into a traveling exhibition and a book called Rediscovering Forgotten Thai Masters of Photography. He is also the guest photography lecturer at the Faculty of Communication Communication Arts at Chulalongkorn University and the director of Kathmandu Photo Gallery in Bangkok. Among the seven photographers featured in Thai Masters is Pornsak Saktenprai, a studio photographer from Northeast Thailand whose clientele mostly included rural Thai citizens from nearby farming communities who were inspired by the visual language of Thai country music in the 1960s. Manit's treatment of this archive as a curator raises interesting questions about photography and national identity in Thailand. In addition to this, it also bears resemblances to MAP's own efforts with Suresh Punjabi's work. Finally, Alisha Sett is a writer, curator, educator, and the course director for aesthetics, criticism, and theory at Gyanprabha, Mumbai. She is also a part of the collectives Gun Cotton, the Kashmir Photo Collective, and Round O Films. To paraphrase Alisha's words, the Kashmir Photo Collective's collaborative approach to digital archiving building particularly, embodies the role of the unexpected visitor who stumbles upon the forgotten and paves pathways through the archival process that allows us to see Kashmir anew. All right. I seem to be having a little trouble opening my video. Shilpa, could you help with that? Perfect. Okay. Right. So now, without further ado, I'd like to open it up to our panel. But before I do, one more thing. I encourage our audience watching from home today to send questions as we sort of carry through our discussions in the chat box. And at the end of our discussion, in about 45 to 50 minutes, we'll take a look and dig into that. And hopefully we can get some answers from one or many members of our panel. So Manit, perhaps we can open this up with you. Based on your work, I had a question broadly. Your work on collecting and curating the photographers in Thai Masters sets up a broader ambition. In the book, you mentioned that, quote, as long as our photography academics do not seriously research and collect the work of Thai photographers of the past to create our own text, then we would continue to have to breathe through the white man's nose. In what capacity do you see your work as creating your own text, and what role do you think this project has played in establishing an identity of photography for Thailand?
Okay, I think I should get back where this idea came from when I started this project, searching for the Thai master, because of I teach photography at the university, and many times I have to mention only Western photographer as a master for my class, and I doubt myself whether how long I have to just teach only the Westerner, and I don't have any name from the local. And when I have this question, I talk to my friend, photographer friend, and no one have any answer. Then that's where I started. Okay, since photography came to Thailand, I think 6 years after invention, it's around about 1846, and then today is over than 150 years. And I think, I mean, how come that we don't have our own master? So in this question is, it challenged me, and also challenged I think everyone. I mean, how can you define master? And I think I should define it on my own term. This is something what I try to do. And also on the other way, when I look at photography also is sometimes it the way how I started is like, if photography can, if we treat photography as something that can represent identity, it means that we're dealing about the politics. So then my idea that, okay, when Thailand have people realize that they realize their own identity. I think because Thailand, you know that we from agriculture, we have king, we have kingdom, and normally only ruler caste and roulette. It means that we people in the very level, they might not realize that they have that their life have any meaning to live on. So I think photography, then this photography step in this in between this. I think that's how I treat that. So uh, when we realize that our identity is important, that's why I look at the photo studio, because when people go to photo studio, it means they realize that they exist in this world. When tomorrow is my Chinese uh, New Year, I have to, worship the old photograph of my grandparents, you know. So photograph is represent a lot of things, it's a lot of meaning. So from this, I think if we treat photograph in the broader meaning and have I mean a lot of uh, connotation. So then that's where I start, and my project start from that. I look for, I try to look through the photo studio uh, all over the country where any archive still exists, and many, because we move into the digital era. Many photo studio, they already closed down and they destroy all the negative, and you know everything is gone. So that is why I think I start a little bit late, so I should start early than this. I can save a lot of stuff. But anyway, what I found from my own judgment, because of, even though I know that some studio they still have stuff left, but I still, as an artist, I look for something also have a aesthetic aspect too. And they have to have an aesthetic value too. So that's why I have to wait whether I mean how much I can do, and that's why I start. So that's why I found Ponsak Sakden Prai. Ponsak he is one of the quite unique, because of his studio is set up in a small town. Back then, he started in 1959, and the highway start built up over the country because of the government try to, with the support by the U.S. Money, have to bring in the have to modernize, have to develop the country in order to fight against the communism. So that's why, and also Ponsak, he set up at that time. And interestingly, that uh, the at that time is Thailand quite unique in terms of the popular music, especially the country music. And farmer, the young farmer, they love to listen. And the only way they can connect to outside world, because through the radio, and they can imagine that when the tour, when the country band came to the town, to the village, and then they open, some mini festival, and then this is the farmer, they go and they want to, they love it. And Ponsak, he quite clever, and he know that this is something that people want to. They say it's a kind of he create his studio like a people can how you call can can play as in their own fantasy. So that is why Ponsak, his business is quite successful in terms of creating like cover, the album cover, you know, everyone can look like a singer, a popular singer, you know, folk, the country singer. I think this is how his studio start, and that I uh, try to in incorporate my idea, my hidden agenda, that why I want concept in my project, and also uh, I want the the other studio in the south in Phuket in my project, because they somehow this studio have a totally different way of express themselves. You know, this is what I found.
Thank you. Yeah, and even in the opening and the introduction of your book, you talked about how when selecting these masters, so to speak, you were sort of attuned to both the social context that they were coming from, the development of Thailand, and also the aesthetic qualities of someone like Ponsak. I think one thing that you said about the performance aspect, particularly related to Thai country music, and how performance was sort of a big part of representing yourself as a sitter in the studio, reminded me of something that Shan, you and I briefly spoke about in an earlier conversation, where in talking about Portal, your book, and your approach to the Bose Color Studio archive, and it does take a different approach. And we spoke about how you said studio photography inherently infuses fictional aspects into the subject. So that's sort of the format you were already working with. And then the book furthers these fictional aspects of representation with those of presentation, of the actual archive and its material qualities. How were you thinking of these aspects of representation, documentation, and fiction when you were considering the archive you had found, and how to sort of present that in the format of a narrative book?
Well, Varun, the phrase that you use, that expressions of ambitious selfhood, I would say that what I found out that this particular thing existed much before photography came into practice, because like if we consider people who commission their paintings, when they posed for paintings, they didn't really want the painters to portray them as they were in real life, but kind of like a aspirational image to them. And that is kind of that goes on till now, because if you see like people right now on TikTok, they are doing the same thing. So it's just that previously they, in order for a subject to achieve that portrayal of ambitious selfhood in terms of in a visual media format, call it a painting or a photograph or a video, previously they had to depend on a crafty technician like a photographer or a painter and like the subject would carry out their aspirational image, and it depends on the technician and the technician's aesthetic sensibilities to merge and like produce the result. So now that is inherently fictional. The important thing that we see in here, that the authorship of the final product, that the image doesn't really lie on the photographer or the subject, because it's the collaboration between the subject and the photographer kind of it becomes more evident when the subject has more agency, like because in a way the subjects are also clients. So it's not the same in case of a documentary photographer, because in many cases, if you consider, the subject is often not aware of their photograph being taken. But in studio photography, the subject is aware, the subject is participating, and the subject is often coming up with the ideas. And so the result will always contain that element of fiction in it. When I was working for my book, the studio photography archives that I researched, I saw that this question of agency often gets blurred when the photographer and the subject, they belong to a vastly different socio-economic class. Because before independence, when during the British times, the aspirational selfhood of a subject often derived from the images of British people. But when the British photographers took an image of a native Indian for anthropological purposes or otherwise, it's always that gaze of exoticism always kind of infuses itself into it. So in the kinds of photographs that I referred to in my book, I tried to avoid that sort of gaze and only considered the gazes which I thought that the subject and the photographer are they come from a comparable class and privilege, to be precise. And later on, after independence, the aspirational selfhood would, in most of the cases, turned into popular cinema like Bollywood, and people borrowed poses, people borrowed props and clothes, and presented an image like that of in a film, like they're the protagonists of a movie. Now, it's always when you talk about fiction in studio photography, it always this aspirational selfhood would portray them in a favorable light. Like nobody as a client would to expose their shortcomings, would like to expose their shortcomings on a photographic representation of themselves. So I remember one instant that a particular photo that I found in one of the family albums that I was looking at, that which required, which was a photograph taken at a studio, and the person was handicapped, and the photograph was necessary because the subject had to had that photographic proof of his handicap in order to get the benefits from the government. But the studio photographer not only highlighted that handicap, but didn't portray the handicap as a shortcoming of the subject, but the studio photographer infused a kind of a sense of dignity into the subject that it would seem like the subject kind of rise above the handicap and still be present, still be present in terms of an aspirational selfhood that you mentioned. So now there comes the craft of the photographer. And in today's times, when the people, when they carry out their ambitious selfhood in videos and in social media, when they don't require the technician or the photographers or the painters input in it, they take the help of filters and various other apps to introduce that fictional element that would elevate and that would hide their shortcomings and get them closer to their aspirational image. So, but in that case, I think it would be interesting to see in the future where this trend leads to.
Right. Yeah, thank you. I think I'd like to pick up on two of the things you mentioned. Three words definitely stuck out. You talked about authorship, agency, authorship in the production of the image in the studio, agency of the sitter, and distance between the photographer and the sitter. I'm also interested in this idea that you brought in about how these three may be refracted through digitization or digital presentation of archives. And in fact, that's actually something that I'd like to ask you, Alisha, particularly also, so if we were to see distance as perhaps distance between the archivist and the material, so to speak,
Yes.
of course, that also presents its own pitfalls and opportunities. You've mentioned before, you've written about this, about how translating a physical archive digitally is not a casual act, and one that must, as you say, engender a certain respect for history. One important way in which you seem to have done this with the Kashmir Photo Collective is making sure the agency of contextualizing each photo remains with the progenitors of the archive, who also remain its co-owners. This collaborative approach to archive making is ultimately an act of care. Yet, as you know, this isn't always the case. So in your experience, I guess you can approach this question however you like, but what gaps have you seen in the conversations around digitization and dissemination of photographic archives? And how do you think these issues could be approached differently, even though that may not be something that's happening right now?
Yeah, it's interesting to answer that question, I think, especially after what Manit and Shan have shared, because, in Manit's case, he's tracing a history of being a photographer himself and looking for inspiration, particularly in terms of, the aesthetics of photography from within the Thai context. And then Shan is talking about, how we have to recognize the entire studio process, but also just look at photography as one of many acts, right, that have taken place within visual media. And so but when it comes to, I think, when we have my concern, I think, from the piece that you read out, with the need to now start differentiating how we treat different kinds of photographic archival material, comes from the concern that I see people treating family photographs, family archives, moments that were created to remain extremely private, with the same sort of ease that they treat material that was created to be public. So for example, if you're looking at images within a magazine archive, right? So say within the Kashmir Photo Collective, if we were looking at a series of college magazines that were archiving and images within those college magazines, those images were created for public circulation. right? Or similarly, if you're looking at images such as when people have posed together in a classroom photograph, right? Or when people have posed together at work, to commemorate a conference that has taken place. There's an awareness in that image being made that this image is going to be seen by a large number of people. However, when you have images that are created within domestic spaces, intimate moments within the home, family holidays, and now as there is more and more of a desire for people to do public history in visual ways, I often see what I see is two very different types of imagery being treated as if they're exactly the same. And sometimes even with a lack of concern for whether or not the people within the image may have other people who know them and they may not want to be seen like that. So just to extend the point that Shan was making about whether it's an ambitious selfhood or not, right? The fact of the self being represented, there's an increasing also, I mean, on the one hand, what he's talking about with people's ability to choose their own filters and have access to technology themselves to represent themselves. But we also see with meme culture, and I think with the circulation of images at a very rapid pace, and of course, this kind of fear that we find of the fake news, but that fakeness that we're discussing, this cutting and pasting that we're discussing, is also happening with historical images, is also happening in moments when people weren't expecting those photographs to be used publicly after 50 years, right? So particularly because we are dealing with images that come out of primarily family archives, for us, after we actually scan each image, a very essential part of revisiting the archive with the family is to actually ask them for each individual image, whether or not it's an image they ever want to be seen in the public domain during their lifetime, whether they are okay with that image being used for research purposes by, say, scholars and others who are looking at the image as historical material, or are they actually comfortable with those images becoming part of the archive that we would like to use for aesthetic purposes, right? So the aesthetic, the historical, and in many ways the field of ongoing scholarship, ongoing research, right? Especially when you're dealing with a conflict zone where the politics of what images may become contentious also changes day by day. An image that may seem innocent last week may no longer be innocent this week. And we have to be very aware in our work of constantly being in conversation with the people who these images really belong uh, to make sure that they are not put in harm's way. But I think also there's also a desire to break away from this ease of just using somebody else's images in whatever way you want, you know. And that's the simplest way that I can put it. I think artists, as this idea of archival practice has grown, I do think there has been a bit of an abuse of artistic license in the ways in which domestic images especially are being used. So these are some of the concerns that I've had when viewing the growth of this desire to very quickly disseminate historical imagery online.
I'm curious, from the last thing that you said, do you feel that sort of mismanagement, I suppose, is due to and it's sort of an aestheticization of the oldness of photographs, or the family aspect of unearthing something? Or I suppose both in a sense also.
Yeah, I think it's both. But I think it's also, I think sometimes people are not aware of how easily these objects are then being commercialized and trying to be brought into the conversation of, like, how art can sometimes commercialize and commodify everything. And sometimes I see that process is really problematic when it comes to the use of family photographs, particularly, like I said, if you as a visual artist are looking at an image, and even if you find it online, even if it's publicly available, as Shan was saying, if you can see that that image was meant to be kept intimate, right? And then you still make a choice to somehow use it in your work, you're making that choice. So sometimes I think also in this desire to make like a conversation about post-internet art very visible, and how, you know, images are now available to all of us, there's the care that Shan was talking about with regards to actually looking at, okay, at the moment that this image was being made, what was happening between the person and the photographer. For the person, whether it's the archivist or whether it's the artist, whoever is then looking at that image and thinking about using it in a new way, for them to be responsible into for reading the politics of that moment. You know, I don't think we talk about that enough, how we can all be responsible for reading what is happening in that moment, and that somewhere all of us do know when we're looking at an image whether or not we should be giving it a new life, you know, or a new form.
Yeah, thank you. I'm going to make sort of a looser connection with your work, Manit, and with the book in general, but specifically with Ponsak's archive, but please feel free to bring in others of the other 6 masters as well. But I'm curious about this work, this sort of balance between the aesthetic and the historical is something that you are both aware of and were thinking about as you were presenting not just the book, but the exhibition, the traveling exhibition itself. I'm wondering, what is your experience of the way in which this exhibition was received, both in Southeast Asia and South Asia and sort of beyond? And what was your sense of the way in which perhaps people were engaging with both the context and the aesthetic appeal of these images, or were you anticipating anything different in terms of how people might react to different aspects of different masters? And how did you, when you anticipated this, did that come into the way you were curating the exhibition and the book as well?
I'm not sure that I can answer that, but I think let's say from my experience, because of when this project finished, and the response from the public is quite strong, because especially for Thai audience. I mean, I never have, I mean, a huge let's say audience at the opening, and people grab the book and then they want to have book. I mean, I saw my book at the opening, 100 copy at the opening. It shocked me because of it means something that people hungry for, to learn about their own culture. Let's say, and I say through photography, they want to grab something about the past. If you know about, I mean, Thai history a little bit, I give you a little bit background why this kind of the reaction from audience, because of Thai history for students to learn. They based on about story about the king. It's not no story about the common people. It's just about the king. How about the king so great? I mean, this is the story about very nationalistic. I mean, way of portray the country. So that's why from today people, I think they have, let's say they're quite open. Thai people quite open, and then I think they realize that, I mean, the country is not just built by only the king. I mean, what about the subject? What about the people who die for in the war for the king to be gory. So then that is why people start question about what is that the only history we learn, and what about our own history? What about commoner? Any commoner have a good thing to say? And that's why people start to look back, try to be critical about the history, to be critical about the nationalism. So that's why history become the key. If you start, students just learn only something that the government forced them to know, and then what else they know? How can you know about yourself if you just know just only the thing that they want you to know? So like the old say that if you control the past, then you can control future. And that's why what the government is doing. I think in every country they're doing this. They try to control history. So as photography is a visual memory, and that is why it's important that we have to use this visual memory, to benefit the public, and then when my exhibition travel to Singapore and Malaysia, they also have some kind of similar thing. They feel the connection, because we live in the same region, and we somehow more or less our culture is quite similar, uh, and we're quite close. And that is something that also they they also have the same question. And this is a starting point. But my project is like a kind of the starting point that people can inspire them, that they can do something like this. They can now, someone came to me and say, okay, now I go back and to my family and just dig up my story from my own family. So they go through their own family album. I think this is interesting, because from this it means that it's quite important. One day I walk in Tokyo, and I walk with my the gallery owner, and then we found a stack of the photo album, a family photo album of one guy. And when I flip through, this is they just dump on the street, and if we just flip through the whole album, I think it's fantastic. This is the story of the guy who probably was supposed to be a CEO in somewhere in Southeast Asia, and then he even draw the map, writing the caption and everything, and he tell his own story. But very unfortunate, the family, they don't want, because probably this guy passed away. And that Japan, the space is important. You don't have much space for the thing that you don't need. So their family decide that this story they don't want. So they just dump on the street. And then I say, and I talk to my friend whether you want to keep this in Tokyo, or if you don't, I would carry back to Thailand. So something like this is quite amazing. I mean, you can go through your own archive in your own house. You don't have to go too far away to search for archive. I mean, my parent, my father, and my mom just passed away a few years ago, and now I start digging up his photograph and try to see whether I can do something. I can create a new work from photograph that he left for me. And this is how you can work with the existing archive to create a new work. I mean, this is how I treat archive. I look at the archive as a living object. It's not a dead object. I think it has the potential, you know. It's just us who can give a meaning. So this is how I found when I work on this archive, because after I've been just chasing for photograph, you know, and now I hardly carry my camera, and now I just look at the existing images, you know. That's what I do today.
Yeah, thank you. This idea of the archive being living is definitely also something that I see, Shan, in your work as well, especially sort of your with the portal project. This idea of taking a found archive and then representing a certain trajectory or chronology through certain design interventions. You've mentioned in a previous interview how you wanted the book to look like so a meticulous note taker made the diary, the format of the book, as opposed to someone who is an art photographer or sort of a studio photographer even. So that aspect of materiality and even just the physical work of collecting and presenting, which is so crucial to all three of yours work. Shan, I'm wondering, in terms of this non-photographic material even, how did treating that change your conception, if at all, of the archive, and what tools do you think are available for sort of reinterpreting archives in sort of an ethical way and trying to engage with the life in them, so to speak, using some of the material interventions you have done in Portal?
Yes, Varun, the thing is that this, what Manit said, that the archive is a living thing, is very apt, because the meanings that the viewer takes from one particular archive, it changes over time, like, and it changes over viewership, who's accessing it, and like who's using it, and when, and where lies the general moral compass of that time. Like, for example, an archive which was made public in the 1930s carried some sort of meaning in 1960s, and in 2020 it might just open up to newer possibilities, because the viewers, as in a collective sense, the collective viewers' ideas about what is ethical and what is responsible, and what was to be done with the archive has changed. So in Portal, I introduced certain things, certain storytelling devices, like bringing in an unreliable narrator and using parts of like narrative, incomplete parts of narrative as a container for that. And the book is set where the narrator lives in the 1990s. So there are certain things that I introduced in the book which would not be really proper if this was a story made in the 2010s. So the various methods of dissemination of a particular archive, whether the archive, parts of that archive is ending up in a book, or parts of the archive is ending up in a movie, or in a class, or in a political propaganda. This kind of influences the material truth that is there in the archive in such a way that even in these days, right now in 2021, it's very difficult for a casual viewer to identify what's really true and what's not. I mean, especially as you see that in previous archives, all the photographs or like documents, they had a material existence. So if there any doubt arises, there lies a possibility that one would dig deeper and find the material, and then ascertain the origins and the ontology of that particular object. But in terms of digital documents, photographs that are made now, the documents that are made now, which don't have a material existence, it is really difficult to say that how this how in 30-40 years down the line, like how they would be used in a responsible or in an ethical fashion. We can't really, none of us can really guarantee that. So that's kind of quite problematic, I would say. And in this time of post-truth, the material that are the content that are generating now, I guess we have to kind of design some sort of a newer recognition model where we introduce the sense of, rather we introduce the sense of ethics and responsibility to future viewers, like whether they want to whether they're like artists or historians or students or politicians. So otherwise it would be interesting to see what happens, but I am not too hopeful of the chances that these things will be retain a certain sense of sanctity in them at all.
That idea of material truth that you spoke about, I think it captures a lot of different elements, and seems like definitely something that you were trying to accomplish in addition to the presentation of the photographs as well, is like sort of a rather realistic, or at least true to form, understanding of the diary itself. I guess so. I know we're sort of inching closer to the end of the hour, but I want to have one more question before we have a couple of questions from the audience as well. But Alisha, since you've written about non-photographic material that finds its way into the archival encounter, on your side as well, be they handwritten notes, recordings, annotations, all of which become entwined in the way in which the archive is framed. Again, sort of speaking to the collaborative aspect of the work. You've also previously written about this idea of the borrowed archive. So I'm wondering if you could tell us a little bit more about this idea of borrowing, and how has collecting and caring for this material, photographic or not, influenced the way in which you think about this act of borrowing and any ethical responsibilities that it may contain?
Yeah, so I found the idea of thinking of the archives that, I mean, the collections that we were archiving as borrowed material really helpful in thinking about it with a sense of kinship, So, if we are, I think I also want to return to this phrase that Manit brought up of the importance of visual memory. Right? What is it that, at least for us as archivists who are interested in the visual memory of a place that has had such an expansive visual impact, right? Kashmir is one of the most documented places in the 19th century, and the tropes that are created there kind of continue to circulate and have an impact on how that place is viewed. So we were also working within a place in which it could be sort of imagined that everybody thought they had, even if they'd never been there, some kind of visual memory attached to the place, right? So you're never, when you're looking at a subject, when you're looking at a place, every kind of every place has its own visual trajectory that you first have to be aware of. So with Kashmir, that was very, present in our minds. And so the idea of uh, the archival encounter, right? And the idea of needing to capture everything that happened in that moment in which we first encountered the images, recording the family's responses in that moment, having the work of the archiving take place in the space of the home. When we then left that space, it really felt like, and it continues to feel like whenever we do use the images in any public forum or any kind of research, that we are just using these images in a borrowed way. So when I wrote about this, when I wrote about the idea of the borrowed archive, I think it was also to push us, and I saw that some of the questions that have come up in the question box sort of refer to this, right? How do you sort of treat images that may have been orphaned? Is it fair to kind of create a fictional story out of material that you may have found? And if you think of it as material that has only been given to you for some time, that is in your care, right? That what if you were the person within those images, or what if this was your history, your narrative, your landscape? I think those ideas become automatically much easier to understand. But the other kind of key reason why I wanted to use the term borrowed is to kind of break this chain of proprietorship which exists around the notion of images. So we often also find that we are living within a post-colonial legacy where we've had a lot of our images, objects taken away from us into other spaces. And so if we as archivists, even if it is digital archivists, if we also start coming into spaces and removing objects, or even kind of digitizing an object and then kind of removing its aura, saying that okay, nobody else can digitize this object, now we have digitized it, now we are going to control the scholarship around it, I am the only person who will get to work with this image, you are only furthering this logic that you have some kind of control over the life of an image when truly nobody does. So one of the reasons for also working digitally, apart from for a lot of people it comes out of financial constraints, it is also because you can then leave the image where it is. The image itself, with the person who has it in that moment, can continue its own life. They can give it to another family member. Somebody else can come and encounter it. So I think it's important when speaking about the process of digitization to also say that we are turning the archival logic on its head. That now when we're having these archival encounters, they don't have to be as violent as they have been historically. That we now have the opportunity to kind of to be only one of the many people who is responsible for an image. So I think that need for people to really have a moment of self-reflectiveness when they are encountering an archive about what is the relationship they are prepared to have with that material, with that story over the long term, but also that you know do they really need to be the only people then dealing with that material? Why not leave it open to interpretation for much longer? Exactly because of what Shan said, 20 years later somebody else may come along and have an entirely different way of looking at that image. So with this logic of which also comes a lot not just from archives but the history of art, right, of locking things away once they have been given value, that is what I believe all of our archival processes need to really challenge. Hence the borrowed archive.
Yeah, thank you. And I'm glad you also touched on some of the questions that have been coming in as well. And perhaps this is a good point to sort of end my questions and quickly pick up the questions. I think one, Alisha, you already addressed, but since we're talking about sort of digitization and how, Shan, like you said, photograph may not be seen in the same way over decades, I think perhaps a good point to end on is with this question sort of focused on the future. How may we think about archives in the future today, especially with the technologies of dissemination, social media? So the question is, do you think that people who are children now, who are growing up with social media, et cetera, that societies may regard the boundaries between personal and intimate, public and fine, or public and private, to be shared indiscriminately in a different way. And how might this impact, and what might this have an impact on archives in the future? So is your sense that technologies of dissemination today may radically change the way in which we remember in the future? And this can sort of go to no particular person, but if anybody would like to chime in with some final thoughts before we close out, I think, please.
I just have one thing I want to say about that, which is there's a contradiction with new technology that we always have to be aware of, that we're talking about, that the material being disseminated now online. One is that it's always already archived, right? So the corporations that own the platforms on which you are putting your material have some record trace of it within their systems. And many of them are already aware of the monetary value of these records that you are giving to them for free. So archives are being built, as we speak now, in ways that we could have never imagined. But who they are owned by and what purposes they will use them for it's revealing itself already politically, but it's, we will see in time. But the other side of it is that because of the pace at which technology is changing, right, the obsolescence that we're now dealing with, maybe there is a file which you can no longer view on the computer that you have, right? This question of how are we going to preserve things that form of technology is no longer widely available, right? And that the exclusivity which that is going to create in terms of who can access that material, even with something as simple as, say, cassette tapes, right? You have to have something which can play a cassette tape in order to have it be a part of your records. So I think that contradiction between everything already being archived and rapid obsolescence is really the tension that we're dealing with now.
I think I like what Shan said about especially about digital information, digital image. Let's say today people, they don't use, hardly use film. They use digital, right? So everything keep in a digital format. And then let's say if you look back maybe 15 years, 20 years ago, when the digital camera introduced, and you look at that, and if that photograph from that time and now you use today, can people see the difference? Because maybe they can't tell the differences between the format, because of it's keep in the digital format. But the thing that they can tell the difference is because of the environment, the subject, or the style there, But then the thing is how can you prove the authenticity that I think Shan already touched upon. I think this is important, because even the photograph that you put online is already, stay, in somewhere. If you Google, then you maybe that photograph you can use that. And now I don't know, because of people tend to treat digital photograph, anything online, for free, even though they say they didn't have copyright. Nobody care. You look at what people use that. So nobody care about the copyright, because you use it and you change it, you manipulate it, and you throw away. Every day people, already manipulate digital photograph for their own purpose, whether it's gonna turn it to be a fake news or fake information or whatever, false information. But then the thing is, how can you how can you stop it? No one can stop it. No one. Today, no one can stop it. When I decide that I want my photograph to be seen and I put online, I have to make sure that this is gonna be in the public domain forever. Forget it that you can say that stop, don't use my photo, stop, don't do that. Nobody can stop that. And you see that people they just abuse that because they take it for granted because of the this is digital, you can take it because you have camera, anyone can do that. I mean, back into the film era, in the film era that you have to, because it's very difficult to produce. It costs a lot of money and take time consume, and also consume a lot of resources to produce one photograph. And then, you know, you need to protect your, I mean, your copyright, and also you can control because of the technology is not that advanced like today. But today you have to make sure, you have to make up your mind that this photograph, if you put online, you have just let it go. It's like a bird, let it go, let it fly. It's gonna fly and never come back, you know. So it's somehow I think in the future people have to come and have let's say a new agreement about how to use the photographic any digital information, because this is just too early that to say, okay, you're gonna violate this, violate that. It I think it's gonna change the way how we deal with, because what we're talking now is we use the framework from the analog, try to control the digital. And I don't think now we have to change the way how we conceive the digital information and digital photograph, you know. And this is how I see. And even talking about we have to give a new framework about what about the ethic, you know, what about the ethic. I don't think we can use the same way of we treat the analog. Probably we run in a highway, we drive a car in a highway, we can't use the same rule when we drive in a car in a small road, you know. Probably you have to have a new rule. That is what I see, you know. But the thing is, come back to, and then who benefit from this? This is what if I want to concern, who benefit from this? You know, if the public benefits from this, I think it's okay. You know, but what we concern that it might be benefits to a certain people, certain group of people, maybe certain business, you know, that who want to uh, 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 benefit from this domain. You know, like what we try to fight with Facebook. You know, I mean, we don't like the rule that how Facebook gonna want to keep everything what we post on the Facebook. And if you use another platform, what about the rule? I mean, they can set the rule by themselves, and we have no power to negotiate. We have to surrender. I mean, and that is what's happening right now.
Mhm. Well, on that note, unfortunately, that's all the time we have right now. But certainly, a lot of ideas that could be full panels in and of themselves. So thank you to all three of you, Manit, Alisha, and Shan, for taking the time out to join us and so generously sharing your thoughts with us. And I would also like to thank our sign language interpreter, Atul Kumar, and of course, our audience and all of you for joining us as well. You can find more information about upcoming events at MAP's website, so do check that out. And thank you again. We hope to see you all at a future MAP event soon, in person or online. So thank you. Take care.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Everyone.
Bye bye,
Yeah, bye,
everyone.
bye.
Bye.